name is Kat Arndt, and I'm the head of client growth here at Cedar. Thank you for joining us for today's panel. We're looking forward to an insightful discussion on what healthcare providers should focus on as part of their 5-year plan for the patient experience. Now, between the challenges posed by COVID-19, policy changes, and rapidly shifting consumer expectations, the task of humanizing and modernizing the patient experience could not be more urgent. I have the honor of facilitating today's discussion with 3 impressive healthcare thought leaders who I'll introduce momentarily. First, certainly want to acknowledge our audience. I'm thrilled to see such great attendance. Today's audience includes those across the healthcare industry, including digital health and finance leaders, Cedar employees and friends, and Cedar clients. Today's session is a virtual event, and while our speakers can't see or hear the audience, please feel free to use the chat function by entering your question in the Stage tab. We'll try to get up to audience questions as time permits. Now, along the topic of today's discussion, we've also created a framework for a best-in-class patient experience, which you can download by clicking the Up-Level Your Patient Experience, the Essential Guide, which is located in the reception area or the additional information section in the stage area. The event will conclude in roughly 1 hour. And if you like what you see, please look out for future Cedar events, including our monthly thought leadership series, Cedar Talks. You can join our mailing list via Cedar's website, www.cedar.com/events. But now that I've gotten the logistics out of the way, I am pleased to introduce this afternoon's participants. First up, I'd like to welcome Lankford Wade. So Lankford Wade joined Summit CityMD as CFO last March. He most recently served as CFO of U.S. Anesthesia Partners, a physician organization that provides high-quality perioperative and pain management services. Prior to USAP, Lankford was with Aetna in Hartford, Connecticut, where he spent nearly 5 years in progressively increasing roles, ultimately serving as VP and CFO of Aetna's institutional businesses. Prior to Aetna, Lankford worked with HealthSpring Incorporated, where he was SVP of Corporate Development and Treasurer of the New York Stock Exchange-listed Medicare Advantage operator, serving more than 1 million members prior to its sale to Cigna. Lankford started his career with Morgan Stanley and with General Atlantic, a global private equity firm. Welcome, Lankford. Next up, we have Linda Finkel, CEO of AVIA. Linda is the CEO of AVIA, the nation's leading network of more than 50 health systems and other healthcare organizations committed to delivering innovative, high-quality, high-value care. AVIA works as a digital partner to accelerate their digital transformation. Linda is an experienced business leader, an entrepreneur with more than 20 years running high-growth international companies in healthcare and technology services. Her passion for driving sustainable change in healthcare is rivaled only by her commitment to health and health equity in our country. Thanks for being here, Linda.
Delighted to be here.
Last but not least, we have Arel Lidow, our president and co-founder of Cedar. Arel sets the strategic and technical direction for Cedar's product line and leads the Makers team, which includes engineering, product design, and data science. Prior to founding Cedar in 2016, Arel was VP of Product at AppNexus, where he supervised the development and launch of the company's flagship products. He was recognized as an honorary founder and received the Founder Award for his contributions to the company. Arel began his career as a technology associate at Bridgewater Associates, working on trading systems for the world's largest hedge fund. He graduated from Princeton University with a BSc in electrical engineering and a certificate in finance. All right, well, welcome everyone. I say let's jump in and get started. So last spring, we saw a rapid acceleration of digital health adoption in light of what was happening with COVID-19, which has continued, of course, as we adjust to this new normal of digital-first experiences. Lankford, I'll look to you first. How can providers be more strategic when it comes to long-term digital engagement?
Sure, thanks, Kat. And actually, let me start by saying thank you to you, Kat, Arel, Florian, and the Cedar team for including me in today's conversation. Very, very pleased to be here. As you mentioned, I joined our organization a little over a year ago, right before the pandemic, hit our entire nation, and certainly hit us pretty significantly here in the Northeast and in the New York region. We had been, as an organization, sort of relatively early adopters of digital first experiences, but it was a very small part of our business. I would say we were sort of playing around with the idea. We had been utilizing telehealth as a way to engage with consumers, predominantly in our urgent care business, and on occasion we were using telehealth in our multi-specialty practice as a way to augment face-to-face visits. Now, we, like every other organization in the country, had to figure out how to adapt pretty quickly as our patient volumes and visits, shut down very precipitously, with the advent of the pandemic. And we were fortunate in that we had, as I mentioned, some of those experiences in dealing with patients through a virtual only environment. That being said, we still had to adapt incredibly quickly. We went from probably somewhere around 5 to 10% of our patient volumes on any given day being through virtual visits, and probably less than that, to where by the time we got to the end of March and the early part of April, it was 60-70% of our volumes through digital only engagement. And actually, initially, our providers were relatively reluctant. But when you operate in a production-based compensation model, they figured out how to adopt pretty quickly. And I think at the end of the day, actually, really appreciated the opportunity and the experience that it gave them in order to be able to continue to meet the needs of our patients. And coming out of kind of that initial phase, ultimately we realized that we needed to be more strategic in terms of how we utilized digital only experiences. We recognize that in the long run, it's not going to be represent the majority of the way that we engage with patients, but it needs to continue to be an avenue through which we can engage with patients, because it's an expectation that they've now set with how they want to engage with their providers on a go-forward basis. And so, yes, that need is certainly in the digital care environment in terms of how we engage with patients and provide care to them. But it also factors into other elements of our business. It factors into things like the way that we actually schedule our visits. Previously, most of our scheduling was done through people picking up the phone and calling us, calling one of our call centers, calling one of our offices to get their visits scheduled. And now we recognize that patients want to be able to do that online. And so we need to be able to meet them from that perspective. Similarly, historically, we had patients that when they walked into an urgent care center, they would sit there and wait for the next visit. But with the advent of COVID, nobody wanted to sit in a waiting room anymore. So we've had to roll out digital tools to be able to have virtual queues for being able to have patient visits from an urgent care perspective. So at the end of the day, I think we recognize that this is a need that healthcare has had for a long time to be able to catch up really to most other industries in America. And so we need to be able to meet patients when and how and when they want to be met. And it needs to be, like I said, sort of across the board in terms of the holistic experience that we provide to the patients, from the very first time that we touch them to the point when we actually engage with them through care, and then also on the back end, through our billing and collection experience.
Yes, really the full view. Linda, anything you'd like to add?
Oh, absolutely. To me, Lankford did such a nice job of outlining what the patient journey needs to be. I don't feel the need to double down there, but I think to your point about how do providers do this in a more strategic way, now that we're at a different stage of the pandemic, I think we've developed a pretty strong point of view as we've worked with 45 or 50 systems through this journey. One of them is they need to acknowledge that genie ain't going back in the bottle. Digital is here to stay. And these growing consumer expectations are not going to be ramped back down. And it doesn't really matter the old adage around, patients of a certain age, clearly are going to make this leap, I think is just proven to be really false. And so I do think that acknowledging that it's not unwinding is maybe the first step. Acknowledging that it's not really about just doing digital here and there, but it actually finally is about, being digital in a far more sort of transformational way. And that is no longer the domain of just a chief digital officer or chief innovation officer. It needs to be how every leader within a health system begins to think about how they solve their problems and how they explore opportunities. Not looking through a digital lens first is, in my view, just no option anymore. And I guess I would say that critical to that, to executing on that, is being as systematic about planning for digital as providers have often been about the rest of their strategic planning and asset investment, which is build the roadmap, understand where you're going, get your stakeholders aligned, and start marching down the same path with the belief that your competitive marketplace has changed during COVID. It's not the same group of competitors. And so it's not about thinking in a small way. It's really about thinking about it in a much more, through a much broader strategic lens.
That's really helpful. I love the term that you said, being digital. I mean, that's certainly the new normal and how we all need to think in all industries. In our recent healthcare consumer experience study that Cedar published, we found that more than half of patients have actually delayed care due to COVID-19. A lot of patients want the comfort of the vaccine before re-engaging with care, but they also want touchless technology. Linda, curious, what are some of the trends that you're seeing, and which trends do you think warrant the most attention from providers?
Yeah, it's interesting. First of all, I think Lankford did a really nice job of touching on some of them. In my view, the first obvious one is just this, staggering increase in virtual visits and virtual care. But I think the companion to that is really the transformation of the physical visit. We use the term typically contactless, visits to describe taking every step of that physical visit and that physical patient journey and looking for ways to really reduce the contact in a world where people are concerned, and rightfully so. From a provider perspective, you only have to look at the economic case of the loss of that outpatient business and the downstream revenue, certainly for systems, that follows, to know that this is an area where systems need to be really heavily investing. And so, in my view, that's everything from, what do you do before I get to you, to allow me to register, to schedule, in a convenient way, to see the provider I want to see, when I want to see them, how I want to see them. It's that pre-visit, post-visit check-in that means I'm not sitting in your waiting room filling out your forms. It's how you screen me. It's how you get me to the room in a way that, again, reduces my risk. And then on the back end, how do you allow me to pay for my services, schedule the next one in a way that minimizes the amount of time and risk to do it? And so, I think this, beyond the obvious investment in how you prepare for virtual health, this doubling down on some core elements of kind of the contactless physical journey, to me feels like areas where we're seeing systems make really, really smart investments. Because even when the pandemic feels like it's starting to be in the past, I believe that those investments, pre-visit and post-visit, will be the ones that are really sustainable. And investment, they're just no regret moves for providers, as they think about, where to play their chips in 2021 and 2022.
Yeah, Piggybacking off of your comment around pre-visit, oftentimes that experience that the consumers have, before they even have their appointment or, before they're present for care it really is just as important. And it seems like it's not often prioritized. And can oftentimes be the worst part of their healthcare experience.
Right.
So, Arel, would love to hear from you. What's the value of a strong pre-visit experience, and what can healthcare organizations do to improve that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, getting the pre-visit experience right is so important from a consumer standpoint because it literally sets the tone. It sets the expectation the consumer is going to have of their entire relationship with the healthcare provider, health system. And I'll just say that, I think what we see in practice is not necessarily that the pre-visit experience is deprioritized. It's actually a very important thing to clients that we work with and healthcare providers. But it's actually for whom the experience is being prioritized and for what reason that I think is the issue. And what we see is that, systemically, healthcare organizations tend to prioritize internal process, what tends to be good, for making things work nicely internally over the experience of the consumer very often. And I think the pre-visit experience, because it's such an incredibly powerful consumer touch point, is not something that you should treat purely as just a check the box type of exercise. This is actually something you should think more of as like a branding exercise. This is literally, how consumers are going to perceive your brand and market. So it's incredibly critical that you get that touch point right, and that it's well thought out. So I think it's enormously valuable. I think it would help anyone who's thinking about, implementing a new pre-visit solution to really think about this as far more than just a feature exercise or, how to improve your internal process, but much more of what impression do you want to make for your patients, your users.
Yeah, maybe Arel, to build on that. I can't remember exactly the old adage, but you only get one chance to make a first impression, right?
Yep.
At the end of the day, and I think to your point, that sort of pre-registration process, or even just the registration right up until when you engage with the provider for the first time, is an opportunity again to craft the type of story that you want to give and service that you want to give to that patient at the end of the day. And it's an opportunity to plant seeds in terms of the types of hooks that you want to have into that patient to create sort of a patient or a customer for life in terms of how you are engaging with them. Again, whether it's, hey, that's your opportunity to get them to download your app, right? Or whatever it is to create that lasting, long time engagement with that patient that then not only helps you as they manage their way through their care journey with your organization, but ultimately on the back end as well, because it has so much synergies between the front end and the back end. As soon as you get the front end right, it makes the back end experience so much more simplified for the patient at the end of the day.
Yeah. It's also, it's also a really valuable touch point to learn more about your users and about your patients. Users have to engage with you. Usually during the pre-visit experience at some point, right? They need to check in for their appointment. They need to fill out paperwork or, digital equivalent of that. And that's a perfect opportunity to learn about their preferences. How do they want to be contacted? Who are they? What segment of your patient population do they fit into? And that drives how you personalize the experience for them throughout their entire care journey.
With the push for so much of the pre-visit elements to be digital, curious your all's thoughts on, will there be a need for waiting rooms, 3-5 years from now?
I hope not. But, well, I have to say,
my vote is no.
Yeah, I think, I think actually, Summit CityMD is a perfect example of this. When COVID broke out, it was an incredibly challenging experience for all of us. I'm sure for every, every major healthcare provider and physician group. But I think you guys are a perfect example of an organization that adapted really well, under the urgency of having to change. So introducing digital check-in experiences where patients can wait in a digital queue and be texted when they need to show up. So I think this is, one silver lining of COVID is that it's really forcing, I think, us to look at new creative ways of solving these problems. So I hope that the waiting room will go away. But I'm optimistic that we're going to find new solutions to old problems.
The patient experience, obviously, the pre-visit side is a big piece of it. The actual time with the provider is obviously critical, but it's, a third of patients don't believe that healthcare providers have done enough to improve the patient billing and the payment processes. Lankford, would love to hear from you. What are some best practices for achieving an effective patient financial engagement strategy? Maybe if you can also speak to some of the pain points today.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think at the end of the day, that sort of collection experience, it's derivative of ultimately some of the things that we've been talking about in terms of how that experience started up front, in terms of how you were engaging with the patient, right? I mean, historically, the healthcare environment was you collect patients' demographic information on paper, somebody puts it into a system, ultimately they leverage whatever was put into the system to contact the patient after the fact to get them to pay for a bill. That was inevitably fraught with issues of, did the patient, put the right information on the form? Did they fill in everything completely? Did they provide their cell phone number, email, et cetera? Did somebody put it into the system the right way so it was fully captured, et cetera? And then, ultimately, all of those potential issues manifested themselves in the back end in terms of how you were engaging with the patient. And then ultimately, generally, you're engaging with the patient through probably largely just a piece of paper and maybe a phone call, right, after the fact. I think for all of us, that's not the way any one of us would ultimately, want to be served in any industry. It just, so happened that healthcare was, pretty far, down the curve in terms of, leveraging technology and other means to be able to engage with the patient. I mean, for us, we view that patient financial experience as just another means to form another level of engagement with the patient. It's another branding opportunity for us to follow up with that patient after the fact. Historically at CityMD, our CEO, his mentality was, I really don't want to be too pushy in terms of how I engage with the patient, because at the end of the day, I kind of view the fact that if I have write-offs in terms of how I engage with try to collect from the patient, that's kind of marketing dollars that I'm spending in order to try to get the patient to come back at the end of the day. So very loose touch. And that was sort of the mentality that CityMD had been able to form. Now, I think ultimately we came to the realization, one, financially, that wasn't necessarily the right decision to make. There was opportunities that we were missing out on. But also, again, to my point, it was another opportunity to create a touch point with that patient. Because for us, a big part of our, particularly in the urgent care side of the business, a big part of our business is getting repeat customers, getting people to come back and utilize our services over and over and over again. And we're largely a fixed cost infrastructure. So the more patients that we can get to come and see us, ultimately, the better off we will be at the end of the day. So again, that engagement strategy with the patient on the back end, yes, we are asking them to pay a bill for the services that we provided for them. Hopefully, they're happy about being able to do that because they had a good experience in doing it. But again, it's another opportunity for us to get our name and our face in front of that patient so that they want to remember that good service that they had and want to come back to be able to engage with us at the end of the day.
That's really helpful. Thank you. So much of consumers' expectations are shaped by other industries, right? They're demanding better experiences in healthcare because the expectations that are set from companies like Amazon and Netflix with these best-in-class digital experiences. Arel, would love to hear, from you, why do you think these kind of companies have such an influence on consumer expectations, and what can healthcare do to catch up?
Yeah, well, I think it really boils down to two things that companies like Amazon and Netflix do. So I think, pretty much every successful consumer company these days has first a very deep and quantifiable understanding of what drives the behavior of their users. They invest enormous resources into measuring exactly, what drives certain clicks or certain behaviors or activities. And second, these companies are literally designed as change machines. They have a combination of culture, process, and technology that's just designed to iterate quickly. It's not crazy. Like literally, Amazon probably tests thousands of different, permutations of things per day. They make hundreds of different changes to their code designed to tweak the consumer experience in various ways and test it. And I think if you look at healthcare, when I first learned about kind of healthcare and healthcare technology, I felt like kind of an alien stepping on to a different planet for the first time. And I think it actually makes sense because, if you're a healthcare organization, historically, what you've been designed to do is almost the exact opposite of what a modern consumer technology company would do. You've been designed to minimize risk and minimize costs. And what that leads to is very slow, long iteration cycles. You want to be very, very careful about every change that you make because you don't want to understandably, you don't want it to affect clinical quality and you don't want it to have a major increase in your costs. But I think in order to be successful and to compete and just deliver an experience that's in line with the expectations of a modern consumer, healthcare organizations need to change that mentality. They need to start thinking, I think, about the consumer engagement side a little bit differently than the clinical side, and actually design a separate culture that's really designed around embracing change and creating this virtual feedback cycle where you can test out many, many different things. Accept that maybe it might break things a little bit more often, but that might be okay. If overall it results in a significantly better experience for your consumers.
The only thing I would add to that, is that where I see good news, Kat, is that I think that providers get it now in a way that they absolutely did not. They were not prepared to sort of, walk the walk. Even 2 years ago, I laugh when I joined AVIA, we were a team of, 4 or 5. And I remember having to pull the word consumerism out of all of our documentation, after having offended, at least, 1 or 2, leaders, health system leaders along the way who said, never call them consumers, in front of my physicians. And so, this, while change has been really slow, and I always hesitate to ever use the term the gift of COVID, but if there was a silver lining of COVID, is it did harden provider understanding around the need to really meet consumer expectations in a radically different way. And I think that and that is, at this point now, they understand I've got to do it. The challenge becomes, how do I do it? I've thrown a lot of spaghetti at the wall to navigate through COVID, but how do I make sense of these investments? How do I rationalize them? And how do I build not just 5 siloed digital experiences, but how do I really make this sort of smooth experience for my patients and consumers and for my providers? And to me, it's an argument that the companies who will really win in this space, and I obviously think Cedar's one of them, is those that really don't just solve a skinny piece of that problem, but are really prepared to tackle the journey. I feel like systems, acknowledge the need now in a very, very different way that I find pretty gratifying. Gives me hope.
I mean, consumers, or patients, I should say, are consumers on at least 99.5% of the time, right? So certainly it's not exactly to only think about them as patients.
Yeah, you should know that in the last, probably the last 3 years, we were able to, again, do a word search and quickly put back in, consumer, all the places where it said, patient. And the reality of it is that, that the idea of that putting anybody off, I hope is long in the distant past.
I think just to layer on top of that, one of the things that I think is different today than was where we were 5 or 10 years ago is that I think technology is much more accessible for healthcare organizations today than it ever was before. Having operated in big healthcare organizations before, there was this tremendous pressure. Again, it's provide great care at low cost, right? And low cost generally means, hey, I don't want to invest a lot of money in building large IT staff, right? To be able to support the types of technology that existed 5 or 10 years ago. I think with the advent of cloud-based computing, software as a service, et cetera, I think technology is a lot more affordable and accessible for healthcare organizations. They don't need to build huge IT staffs to be able to support it at the end of the day. I think technology is a lot more plug and play, across different silos in a way that it wasn't before, so that information can flow kind of back and forth. And I also think to some extent, we're reaching a bit of a tipping point in healthcare where if you're not investing in technology, then you're not keeping up with everybody else. If you're not, pushing your organization forward, you're going to be losing out on the ability to engage with consumers, because that's the expectation that they're beginning to set. Whereas again, 5 or 10 years ago, if you didn't offer that, digital experience, most consumers weren't used to it, so they didn't really ask for it, and they didn't know any different. But nowadays, it sort of has reset the expectation. So I think we're going to see technology adoption for sure accelerate here going forward for a number of the reasons that I mentioned.
Yeah, no, that's really encouraging. I think the old debate of build versus buy. There's so many innovative companies out there with expertise to help healthcare partners, so they don't have to do it themselves and can certainly focus on other things that are important for patients. Let the experts come in to help. Consumers are also leveraging as much information as they can from their peers when it comes to choosing a healthcare provider. In our study, we found nearly 100% of consumers who consult reviews say that they're influential in some way. So Linda, would love to hear from you. Can you elaborate on some of the risks of really failing to adapt to these increased consumer demands?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I do think we think about this issue of transparency, even more broadly than reviews, which is price transparency and quality transparency and wait time transparency. But I think that the table stakes issue is clearly the review, and the cost for a provider of not acknowledging that is really untenable at this point. To me, it impacts patient acquisition in a radical way. The simple fact of the matter is that consumers will go elsewhere if you're not actively managing the information that they learn about you and are able to glean about you, from your peers. And at a time where health systems are struggling to meet, some of the other kind of demands around transparency, to me, they feel there's a special obligation to take the sort of review and rating piece, very, very seriously. Because the simple fact of the matter is there are a million really interesting options at the moment. To me, suddenly, it's not just, the provider down the street who also is not doing a fantastic job. You suddenly have direct-to-consumer options that are very viable. You only need to look at, CVS, Walgreens, Village MD, and ultimately the threat of Walmart to know that there are lots of really convenient options. And while, we work with a lot of systems who don't make money on primary care, they're not willing to forego owning the on-ramp to their system. And I think what they understand is that any of those disruptors, whether they're traditional retailers, whether they're digital first native like Hims and Hers, have the power to disrupt their referral base and to send them in very, very different directions that can make it nearly impossible for a health system to really thrive in a new digital economy. And so I think the cost is really untenable, and it's just an area that requires very dedicated focus and investment.
And Linda, just to add on top of that, I think in addition to the consumer impact that not having sort of positive reviews about your organization can have, I mean, let's not forget there are a lot of other people that are watching those reviews as well, right?
You bet.
Big self-insured employers, they're watching those reviews to understand, again, where they want their employees going to be able to get care. Insurance companies, they're watching those reviews. And I think if you want to have premium pricing for the service that you provide, you better be able to provide a really strong consumer experience and be able to prove it through, again, whether it's through reviews or surveys or other things like that. And on top of that, from a referral perspective, so for an organization like ours, where yes, a lot of our referrals are managed internally to our physicians, but we also refer a lot of patients outside of our organization. And the last thing we want to do is refer patients to somebody that's going to, where that patient's going to have a bad experience, which is then going to reflect poorly upon us at the end of the day. And we would hope that other providers that refer their patients into us would be looking for the same thing in terms of the type of service and solution that we can provide to those patients. So that network effect, associated with again, fundamental transparency in terms of the quality of service that's being provided to the patient is very powerful and increasing every day for sure.
Yeah, reviews are certainly digital currency, and I think organizations have to view it that way. So appreciate the thoughts there. Lankford, I'd love to go back to you to revenue cycle specifically. So, from your revenue cycle perspective, how has technology evolved to meet the needs of providers? And what should healthcare finance leaders look for when they're evaluating new technologies and solutions?
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately it harkens back to some of the things that I've said before. I think today, the beauty of most revenue cycle solutions is that generally, they're fully integrated front end and back end solutions, right? So at the end of the day, they represent the clinical workflows for the organization as well as the back end, revenue cycle workflows. So, again, one side of the organization, the finance organization or the RCM organization, can't make the decision without the full kind of buy-in of the clinical side as well. Again, because that upfront experience and those upfront workflows have tremendous downstream impacts at the end of the day. I think the advent of, as I mentioned, sort of cloud-based solutions, software as a service, I think that makes decisions perhaps a little easier than they were before in some respects, in the sense that the technology support of those solutions isn't as challenging as they once were. But again, in a cloud-based solution environment, what makes it trickier is that you can't customize the solutions to nearly the same extent that you might have before. So I think what that means is ultimately to create that virtual sort of customized solution for your patients. At the end of the day, you have to partner with other solution partners to be able to fill in the gaps. And that's part of the reason why, as it relates to the customer experience on kind of the billing and collections and ultimately some of the front end workflows, we ended up partnering with Cedar to help to support us. Again, Cedar's not our RCM solution; they're not our EMR solution, but they help to fill in gaps in terms of where the limitations of that solution presented itself. So again, you don't have to buy the full solution from one organization. Again, you can create that virtual environment that I think creates the type of experience that we want to create for our own employees, meaning in terms of the clinical workflow, RCM workflow, but then also for our patients at the end of the day.
I would double down on it, Lankford, because we often hear providers or large health systems say, "Oh yeah, we've got the revenue cycle management. We've outsourced," and yet there are these incredible gaps that create opportunities for a much enhanced patient experience and significantly improved financial performance for a system, which is to me just sort of the win-win. I think Cedar's a great example of it. I think there are robotic process automation, tools and capabilities that have dramatically improved, elements of the kind of financial operation, from denials management to prior authorization, that are hugely inefficient, huge cost wasters, patient dissatisfiers, and a source of great, provider frustration. And so I just think, any provider needs, they may feel like they've just invested $100 million in the EHR and they've just brought in a revenue cycle management provider, and surely that has it all covered. But we just find that it doesn't, and that supplementing with best-in-class solutions in really key opportunities areas, just has tremendous potential and is now much more easily accomplished. Via APIs and all the things that make it, much easier than it was, even 3 years ago, to integrate multiple solutions.
Yeah, that's a very fair point. We've come very far. Speaking to customization and, looking at the entire patient journey, in our study, we found that 68% of consumers believe that it's important that healthcare providers enable a more customized experience when it comes to communication, bill pay, scheduling, and obviously other aspects. Arel, would love to hear from you. How should providers incorporate personalization into the patient experience? And what would be maybe a relatively easy lift versus what will require larger shifts in how providers approach personalization?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think if you look at virtually any type of modern consumer technology, there's just incredible amount of personalization built into that technology, whether you know it or not. There's just enormous sophistication and complexity behind the scenes trying to personalize every notification that's sent to you, the way that information is actually presented to you to kind of nudge you as a consumer towards certain behaviors. I think that this is incredibly important for healthcare providers if they want to provide a more modern experience for their consumers, and also if they want to be able to have the ability to kind of influence their patients to make another appointment in the future or do other things. And I think that I generally give kind of two pieces of advice to any healthcare organization looking to kind of personalize their patient journey more. In the short term, kind of the easier lift is to start by understanding your patients deeply, like a modern consumer technology company would. So you can either do this by hiring in-house user experience researchers. There are people who are actually trained to do this type of analysis. Or you can partner with a company that has this competency to do it. And then from that, actually start to construct a segmentation, a sort of psychological understanding of who your patients really are and what drives them. Then once you've done that, you can actually start to layer on quantifiable measurement as well. So understanding aspects like, What are the communication preferences? Like what times of day does your patient population actually, have a higher propensity to engage? How do they like to, how do different segments of the population actually like to communicate with you? How, when they ask for help or need a, customer support, how do they like to do that? Is that via chat or is it over the phone? Those types of questions. All those things, in a well-run kind of consumer-focused organization should be very quantifiably measurable. Then I would say, second piece of advice is sort of big picture. The much harder thing is to start to change the culture of your organization, to shift towards this mindset of rapid iteration. So deeply understanding your users and then being able to change quickly and try many different things to try and drive certain behavior in your user population. That's a much harder thing to do. And core to that is also finding sort of the right technology partner to do that as well, who has the ability to rapidly iterate and try new things as well.
Linda, anything to add?
I think it's, I think you've really said it, Arel, and I do think it's the how do I do that, that probably created the opportunity for us at AVIA to work with providers from, this is the strategic problem we're trying to solve, how do I actually get my organization lined up around the most important things, do those things, find technology partners who can really best support me, and then ensure that I'm getting, the impact. I think it's, for me, sometimes it's the how, now that we've come to terms with the imperative.
Well, if it's all right, I'm going to choose some questions from the audience for you all to answer. So the first one we have here is, how can we best optimize resources and place this patient at the center of all our efforts? Lankford, any thoughts?
Yeah, so for an organization like ours, that's experiencing, rapid growth, right? At the end of the day, resources are always precious, right? And figuring out how to allocate those resources to the highest and best uses for the organization. That being said, I think probably the best opportunity for an organization like ours is to figure out how to partner with other firms, right, that have expertise in this area, versus trying to go out and find those precious resources, with the expertise that may be hard to recruit, sign up, et cetera, right? So again, being able to leverage the expertise of a firm that knows how to engage directly with consumers, knows how to do the types of rapid iteration and testing that Arel's been that Arel's mentioned several times. At the end of the day, again, something that's not necessarily innate to the DNA of our organization, right? So again, it's by leveraging the expertise of somebody else, I think ultimately you'll probably get there faster and more than likely cheaper, probably than you otherwise would, and you won't likely distract the rest of your organization, from continuing to be able to deliver on the mission of delivering care, right, to patients on a day-to-day basis, which is the last thing you want to do in terms of distracting providers from that.
I do think that picking your partners is probably the most important thing that providers can do today to accelerate the pace with which they get to impact, and doing that in a really thoughtful way is just the best path to success. We still see systems that are trying to develop, capabilities that we know that for a very reasonable investment are, 100 miles further down the road that are available to them. And yet, they don't always have the time to look out in the marketplace. And so I do think that thoughtful, partner selection can just be the difference between, success or failure for systems at this point.
Yeah, I just add, I think it's also critically important to really hold yourself accountable, to actually get real about, making sure that you're actually meeting the needs of your patients. It's very easy to sort of, wave things off as, hey, this is how healthcare is, or, when a claim is denied, patient's always going to have to get on the phone with their insurer, things like that. If you really, are honest with yourself and you understand deeply your patients and who they are as not just patients, but as consumers, I think you start to understand deeply where those gaps are, and you'll be able to really then focus on allocating your resources towards those specific gaps and solving those problems for consumers. But start with understanding and really making sure that you have a way of holding yourself and your organization accountable.
A follow-up to the conversation we were having earlier about reviews. Someone in the audience said, we know the patient experience is a critical factor in attracting and retaining patients. I'm curious as to how facilities have modified their patient satisfaction surveys to drill down into the importance of the digital experiences that are offered. Lankford, do you have thoughts here?
Yeah, I mean, it's to some extent, we've already, and as an organization, we've begun to try to drill into that to, again, understand, how and when and where patients want to be engaged. Some of that is through the formality of actual surveys, but a lot of it is actually through the informality of, feedback that we get real time through, the direct engagement between, patient and provider, right? There's a lot that you can learn, right, when the patient is there on the examining room table, and a lot that they'll share with the provider about, overarching their experience. And I think what we've tried to do is make sure that we have kind of formal and informal ways of gathering that feedback from our providers. At the end of the day, some are good at sharing it, some not so good. But I think it's a really good point. I mean, as we continue to evolve, we need to make sure that we get that, direct feedback through formal, surveying mechanisms as well. And I think to some extent, we're getting some of that formality, as I mentioned, through, the partnership that we have with Cedar, in the sense that, they clearly, survey every single patient, right, and get feedback on every single time that a patient engages, with, through the payment experience to understand whether they actually enjoyed the experience or not, and then some of the informal feedback, through the qualitative, feedback that those patients provide as well.
Yeah, I would just add on to that it's very important also to think about the points in the patient journey at which you actually try and get that feedback from patients. So historically, there's been a lot of focus on surveying patients, doing Press Ganey surveys almost immediately after the point of care. And a patient's experience after the point of care and their mindset is actually very different than a couple of months later when they might be dealing with the financial side and the administrative burden of dealing with insurance companies and claim denials and all of that. So it's very important also to have multiple sort of touch points with the patient, I think, throughout their entire journey, both pre-visit and post-visit.
Arel, a question for you from the audience. How does Cedar view their role in the pre-visit experience?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, we recently launched our pre-visit offering, and our broader goal at Cedar is really to fix the overall patient financial journey, and the financial side of healthcare, for better or for worse, is sort of deeply coupled with both the pre-visit experience and the post-visit experience. So I think you'll see us do a lot more on the pre-visit side of things, actually engaging with patients prior to having a visit, to help them understand their costs better and what their options are around the financial side, and also hopefully avoid a lot of the kind of negative experiences that can follow post-visit if you don't collect the right information, or if you don't do the right things before a visit as well. So happy to meet to talk more about that if anyone is interested.
Yeah, Arel, I think you mentioned a good point. I think at the end of the day, a lot of this is about expectation management, right? And I think the more that we can do to set the right expectation with the patient up front when they begin to engage with your organization, I think the better off overall the experience will be. I mean, clearly we don't want to set a poor expectation up front, right? We want to set a good expectation up front. But I think having transparency to things like, ultimately the cost of the services that you're providing to the patient. Of course, could there be sticker shock associated with it? Yeah, absolutely. In some respects, right? If you're going in for, something, that's a very complicated procedure. At the end of the day, it's probably going to cost more, right, than a simple urgent care visit, for example. But I think the more we can set that expectation up front with the patient, I think ultimately the happier they will be, and the more likely they will be to engage on the back end, right, when the time comes to actually to pay the bill, right? If you walked into a restaurant and you ordered something off the menu and the menu had no prices on it, right, and you got a bill after the fact that said, hey, something was way more expensive than you thought you want, you probably wouldn't have a very good view of that restaurant, right, at the end of the day. So, similarly for healthcare, we've been doing that forever, right? So we need to be able to figure out how to help set that expectation up front. And I think there are a lot of healthcare organizations that feel like somehow, that's divulging, sort of the secret sauce, right, of what they do. But, I think at the end of the day, it's actually, to my point about setting the right expectation for the patient. At the end of the day, if you have a premium price for the service that you provide, you should provide premium experience, right, for that at the end of the day. But you should set that expectation up front with the patient.
Absolutely.
Well, final question, and we'd love to hear from all of you on this one. Linda, we're going to start with you. What do you think the patient experience will look like in 5 years?
I think the patient experience is going to be such a different one. I think that I'm going to feel known by my provider. They're going to understand my preferences. They're going to understand I only want to communicate by text up until the moment that I'm getting care. They're going to provide care that leverages my data and in a hyper personal way that results in improved treatment. I'm going to the time it takes for me to go from troubling symptoms to problem solved is going to be compressed, and I believe that the access will be different and broader, regardless of where you live or who you are, or the color of your skin. I believe that the commitment to health equity is real, and that the experience for everyone in our country should be different and will be different.
I love that. That's very inspiring. Lankford,
I'm a believer.
I love it.
Linda, I love your vision. I mean,
Plus one.
I mean, and actually, maybe to build on top of that, again, I don't know whether it's 5 years away or 10 years away, right? But in terms of what we're trying to build, I think very much aligns with that vision, right? We want to open up as much as we can the top of the funnel, right? Create as many opportunities for access as possible, right? And make that access as easy as it possibly can, right? To use the Amazon analogy, make it as easy as one click, right? To get that visit scheduled so you can be able to come in, right? Because at the end of the day, the more that we can do to engage patients as frequently as possible, the better job we will be able to do to meet them when and where and how they need, and to keep them healthy, right? Versus having to deal with them when they're sick. Of course, we're gonna have to deal with people when they're sick for sure, right? But the more that we can engage them up front in that journey, I think the frequency, right, of illness hopefully will continue to diminish going forward. And then ultimately, once they're in and part of our organization, we need to figure out how to get them to wherever they need to be in a very seamless fashion, and make sure that all of their information and all of their preferences follow them, right, as they go through that journey. And then at the end of the day, once they're done with whatever that visit is or whatever that journey is, we need to make the back end as seamless as it possibly can be. So that at the end of the day, if they feel like they got value for the services that they were provided, they are more than willing to pay for it, right? And ultimately more than willing to go back, right, to be able to get that level of engagement again and again and again. And again, to your point, to be able to create healthier communities, right, at the end of the day is our ultimate goal.
Love it. What about Arel?
Yeah, so I think it's hard to top those answers. I'm not sure that there's that much more I could add, but just very quickly, I think not surprisingly, far more of your care journey will revolve around your own personal device, and the messaging and how you set expectations with consumers, the financial experience, the clinical experience, will all be so much more personalized to you and who you are. How something is told to you, will likely be more automated and tied to your device, but the actual messaging and tone of messaging will actually kind of change and adapt to what is most likely to drive a positive outcome for you. So that's how I see it evolving.
All wonderful visions. Well, thank you all for a very energizing conversation today about the patient experience. Audience members, thank you for joining. Don't forget to sign up for future talks at cedar.com/events. But otherwise, thank you and stay safe out there.
Kat, thank you.